So let's talk a little bit about Ukraine, because this is also very important. Big geopolitical situation. And as you alluded to, Krystal, trying to sort through the propaganda from the US government and the Russian government on this thing is the biggest headache that could possibly exist. So let's put it all to you straight. What raised our eyebrows and frankly made me a little bit scared was yesterday the White House really escalating their rhetoric, saying that they believe that an invasion of Ukraine from Russia could be imminent. Here's exactly what Jen Psaki had to say.
Staying on Ukraine and Russia, what does the White House make of the evacuation of Russian diplomatic staff from their embassy in Kyiv? And do you think the threat of invasion is getting higher or lower?
Well, I think, as I noted a few minutes ago, we believe we're now at a stage where Russia could at any point launch an attack on Ukraine. I would say that's more stark than we have been. In terms of the decision to evacuate their embassy or to move personnel out of their embassy, we have information that indicates the Russian government was preparing to evacuate their family members from the Russian embassy in Ukraine in late December and early January. We certainly would refer you to them for more specifics about what their decision is, but we don't have an assessment on why in the meeting.
Okay, Krystal, so one of the key elements of manufacturing consent, especially whenever it comes to a national security operation, is to say things are happening based on intelligence and then launder stuff through the media. Okay, so I've been watching the Russiagate people very closely. Lo and behold, they're getting all sorts of quote-unquote scoops from the CIA and the national intelligence community. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Natasha Bertrand, who's possibly one of the worst examples of a Russiagate reporter, reported all kinds of false information at that time, now says, quote, scoop, the U.S. has information that indicates Russia has pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine, a U.S. official told CNN on Friday, in an attempt to create a pretext for invasion. Story to come. Now, this is again the perfect example of what's the intel? Who actually believes that? They feed it to a friendly reporter, one U.S. official. Does anybody else disagree? But it gets parroted on CNN over and over and over again, gets repeated then to the White House. The White House then reads out a statement saying that we believe something is imminent, all in Ukraine. Let's actually figure out what the hell is going on in Ukraine. Well, there was a revolution. Some say the U.S. was involved. Some say they don't. Back in 2014. Okay. There was a crowded thing. They called it a color revolution. The president was ousted, and a new government of chaos is essentially roiled since then. And then Crimea was also annexed by the Russians. So obviously that was in 2013, kind of preceded some of these events. Well, then what happened? Well, it devolved into a hot/cold civil war in which the Russians were backing some Eastern Ukrainian separatists who largely speak Russian, identify more as Russian. The Ukrainian government obviously did not support that. Big fights here in Washington then, Krystal, over whether the U.S. should arm said Ukrainian rebels. Sound familiar? Was happening in Syria at the time. Obama refused, rightfully, in my opinion, not to arm those Ukrainian rebels. Trump, despite talking about a Russian reset and all of that, actually did arm those Ukrainian rebels. Here's the key point. For an entire, 5-6 years here in D.C., there was a massive fight over arming those rebels. But then once we actually did, nobody actually told you whether it worked or not. And here's the answer. It's 2022. It didn't work in terms of ending the quote-unquote civil war. That didn't happen. We didn't give them enough firepower in order to actually do anything, because doing so would, basically be a Cold War, whatever type move against Russia, and they would probably respond in kind. So we gave these guys all these weapons. It actually didn't work out in terms of moving the battle line whatsoever. And finally, it brings us to the here, 2022. It's been 8 or so years since the said revolution. And at that point, Russia finds that a lot of this basically arming of the rebels, the current discussion within NATO of bringing Ukraine into the NATO alliance and giving them Article 5 protection is unacceptable to them. And they, because they're a failing gas state, say that, hey, we want to remain powerful and relevant on the world stage. They spark this international crisis in turn. This is not the perfect summary, but I'm trying to give you kind of all sides of the debate here. And what then happens is that they say, you, U.S., can de-escalate this now. Let's put this up there from the BBC. They say, right now, you can stop all of this crisis whenever it comes to Ukraine. all you have to do is say that NATO will never include Ukraine. This is where I just am astounded that we are even pretending that it would be in the U.S. national security interest, Krystal, of letting Ukraine into NATO. This was a dream of 2008. But guess what? Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence. It has been for 500 years. They've been fighting over it, was once part of the USSR and all of that. Affording them Article 5 would essentially mean that, you extend the U.S. kind of security nuclear blanket all the way up to the border of Russia. And that is just unacceptable to them from a security situation. And I would just point finally to George Kennan, who was the architect of the U.S. strategy of containment over Cold War, who predicted after the Cold War ended that letting the Eastern Bloc into NATO would spark a new conflict with Russia because it was rubbing it in their face as their downward spiral post-collapse of the Soviet Union.
Not to mention that as part of the deal in terms of reunifying Germany, what we agreed to, we said NATO is not going to expand any further east. And guess what? NATO has expanded a lot further east. And predictably, that has led to these increased tensions. So what we're trying to say is when you're getting all of this in from the US media, all you're hearing is our government's propaganda. And so it becomes very confusing. They have to make Putin, and I'm not saying like standing for Putin or pretending like he's a good guy or anything like that. But you have to imagine that he is some like uniquely evil, bombastic caricature of a person, which is, again, typical of the sort of propaganda that our government ultimately puts out to the consumer, in order to help you understand, well, why is he making he's just super aggressive, and that's the only reason why. And it's just Putin's a bad guy, and we got to figure out how to check Putin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is not to stand for Putin, but to say, from their perspective, they feel like they were lied to by the U.S.
Which is true.
And by NATO allies, which is true, that we have expanded NATO and expanded NATO and expanded NATO, and that has led them to feel like they are under threat. Now, NATO said, we're only defensive, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the other thing that's going on that you will barely see mentioned in mainstream press here. In addition to arming Ukraine, we have also been training, the CIA has been bringing over Ukrainians here to effectively train in insurgency. Let's take a look at this tear sheet. This is from Yahoo News. Let's do this first. Blinken is set to meet with his counterpart, the Russian foreign minister, as Ukraine tensions soar. So we will see what comes ultimately out of that. But let's put the next tear sheet up on the screen there. Here we go. CIA-trained Ukrainian paramilitaries may take central role if Russia invades. This is a very good and very unusual piece of reporting here. The lead is the CIA is overseeing a secret intensive training program in the U.S. for elite Ukrainian special operations forces and other intelligence personnel. That program started in 2015. It's based in an undisclosed facility in the southern U.S. It started under Obama. It was expanded under Trump, and it has been further expanded under Joe Biden, just so you get a sense of how bipartisan the support for the deep state and the military-industrial complex ultimately is. One person familiar with this program put its goals very bluntly. The United States is training an insurgency to kill Russians. Going back decades, the CIA has provided limited training to Ukrainian intelligence units to try and shore up an independent Kyiv and prevent Russian subversion. But cooperation, quote, ramped up after the Crimea invasion, said a former CIA executive. So those are some of the activities that our government is engaged in. Did you vote on that? Did they ask you if you wanted, the CIA to be secretly training covert, training an insurgency here and getting us more entwined? Did they ask you about that? No, I bet they didn't. Just like they didn't tell you that there are reasons outside of just Putin being a maniac why Russia feels threatened by the potential incursion of NATO into Ukraine.
We're not trying to stand for Russia. I don't like Russia. I think territorial conquest and wars of that are really bad. That being said, it comes down to how bad do you think it is? Is it bad enough in order to risk the lives of American soldiers? Here's the problem, which is that currently the Biden administration says that, the penalties for invading Ukraine would be economic only. Okay, that's a proportional response, I think. But here's the problem, right? When you have these CIA-backed rebels, and they're there, and they start firing off, and maybe they fail, and then there's pressure here in the national security state in order to escalate even more. You got to give them more arms. Have you heard this story before? It's called the Bay of Pigs. This literally happened already. And this is the problem. There's steps up the escalation ladder that can make it and bring the tensions extremely high and make it so that, Russia could feel as if we have, literally exported troops here, then encroaching on what they would consider their sovereign territory, especially if they annex it. I'm not saying even that I agree, but it's important to always understand that the enemy gets a vote whenever it comes to war, and especially whenever it comes to strategic posturing and conflict. And trying to understand and see the failures of the U.S. national security establishment. You had the hubris to think that you could invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO back in 2008 and just simply think that the Russians would be too weak and do nothing to care about it is crazy. Look, yes, they're a failing economy, they have massive demographic decline, and their economy is their society is mostly like a joke, but they have nuclear weapons. You have to respect that. These are also historically proud people who are not going to be pushed around and have a much higher capacity for suffering and for tension than we ever do here in the West. Any read of Russian history will tell you that.
Well,
so respect your adversary and understand where they're coming from.
That is true. That is true. And if you don't, then you're going to be very confused about what events are unfolding and why they're unfolding and what the actual options are that are on the table. And even with the economic sanctions, I mean, these are either mostly for show and they don't have any impact, or they fall on not the elites, no matter how you target them. They always have ways of getting around this. They fall hardest on the people. I mean, that's what economic sanctions ultimately do. You're much more likely to punish the Russian people than you are to punish Vladimir Putin with any sort of sanctions regime. So those are the stakes. That's sort of the context as you're consuming news. Just keep in mind that we can very easily spot the sort of like state media propaganda, Pravda and whatever, coming out of Russia. Just know you are getting just as much propaganda from your government. It's just done in an even more sort of like crafty and often effective way because they pose as neutral journalists, which at least some people still believe them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has a capacity to really get completely out of control. When bullets start flying, I mean, missiles, and this is not a joke, this is not some AK-47 war in Afghanistan. This is a real nuclear power. This is a proxy conflict, which has hundreds of years of history and tension. I was just listening to something this morning, a Russian history podcast about wars over like Smolensk and stuff. This goes back to like 1500, right? So it's important to understand that context. It's important to also realize the escalation ladders and that whenever you have constrained options that come from the national security state and their interest and their long-held dream, really, of confronting Russia, that Biden could really be put into a box and put in a situation which is not in anybody's interest out in Eastern Europe.
That's what they're so good at, is putting presidents in a box. And I mean, that's what happened with Bay of Pigs.
That's exactly what happened.
JFK said, no, I'm not going the next level that you want me ultimately to go. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.